We have an absolute date for when they worked this push the second time. That's 299. And we know when that second push ended with the absolute fulfillment of the prophecy in 1840 to a specific date, August 15th, 1840. It came to an end. I mean, that's prophecy, and it was absolutely fulfilled. During the time of the sixth trumpet, we have the French Revolution and the close of prophetic time. Then we have the reemergence of Islam and the third woe. Now, I put a date on here, 1988, and I'm not going to explain that until we get to the trumpets. And I'll show you why I think that that's an absolute time for the fulfillment of this trumpet. The seventh trumpet is the second coming of the Lord. It is the final cleansing of the sanctuary. It declares the coronation of the King of Kings, like we saw, so that it fits in. These trumpets fit into those types that we saw in the Old Testament. Now, before AD 325, I've got this date here because that's the time that this council was called. During the early 300s, there became a conflict between the leaders of the church that were Alexandria in Egypt and those that were in Constantinople and Antioch over the nature of the Godhead. Athanasius said that Christ was 100% God. No doubt about that. He was not in any form, any change, any substance, any different than God the Father. Arius said no, that Christ was a little less than God. He defined it as something along the lines of the Gnostic philosophy, of you have the great God and then you have the demigod. And that's kind of where Arius came from. Well, there were a lot of people that believed Arius. And there was a great conflict that arose in the church over this subject. It was the first major conflict in the church. So in AD 325, Constantine called a council. In 325, Constantine the Great called a council because he was tired of this argument. He had accepted Christianity in 321, was not baptized at that time. He wasn't baptized till he died, or just before he died. But he called a council to settle this issue. So in 325, they had the first church of the council at Nicaea to discuss how to handle the opinions of Arius regarding the divine nature of Christ. And at that time, it fell that Athanasius was correct and Arius was wrong. And Arius was banished. He wasn't killed, but he was banished from the realm. Constantine said, okay, you're a troublemaker, out of here, and he sent him off into the wilderness. Then in 327, 2 years later, Constantine's sister, who was also named Constantius, I mean, they were very unimaginative in these names. All three of Constantine's sons was Constans, Constantine II, and Constantius. I mean, go figure. Seemed like we should have Bill and John and Sam or something, you know. Constantine's sister was dying in 327, and she begged her brother, Constantine, to recall Arius, because she was an Arian, and she said that she felt that Arius had been abused, that he was misunderstood, and that his view on Christ was wrong, it was misunderstood. Constantine listened to her, and he brought Arius back. Between 327 and 359, there were several councils that were called, arguing about who was right over the nature of the Godhead. This was a major discussion. And two of Constantine's sons were zealous Catholics. The third, the one that got the eastern part, was an Arian. So they bickered among themselves. Finally, in 359, there was only one remaining son, and he was the one that had the western sector. He called another council. Now, he was the Arian. He called another council in 359, and he called every bishop in the empire to come to this council. And this council, I mean, this was fascinating reading. I know I'm probably boring you all, but it was fascinating reading. It really was. Because at this council, there was so much trickery, so much intrigue, so much threat of punishment to try to get everybody to sign this creed that had been developed to accept Arianism. So Constantius, who was the remaining son that had now control of the whole empire was his now, he called this council, And he wanted to be sure that everybody could get there, so he had two parts to the council. One was in Antioch, one was in Italy, so everybody could get there. They couldn't say, well, I can't catch a boat, well, fine, we'll just hold it over there where you are. And then he had emissaries that went back and forth between the two councils. At the end of this council, the ones in Italy were all Athanasians, and they said, we're not going to accept the Arian view. Well, Constantius said, then you'll stay in council until you do. And they were there for months, under guard. They couldn't leave. And of course the guard made them terribly miserable. It was cold, and they didn't feed them well, and they were living in miserable conditions. And finally a lot of them did sign, but there were a number that didn't. So Constantius said, no, we're going to have unity here. I want unity. Everybody's going to sign this, that they accept the Arius position, or we don't go home. So the Athanasian bunch said, well, we'll just rework this creed. We'll rewrite it. So they did. They set about rewriting it. And in their wording, they said Christ was not a creature like other creatures. He was of the same substance as God. Well, when they wrote that, the Arians said, okay, we'll sign that. And then after it was signed, then they said, your wording admits that Christ is a creature because you say he's not a creature like the rest of creatures. He is a created being. So they accepted it. That was signed in 359. And from 359, the Athanasians were the one that wrote the creed. They just didn't realize what they were doing. They weren't careful in their wording. So from 359, for a number of years, Arianism was the doctrine of the church because it was supported by the emperor. We have absolute union of church and state. And when you have union of church and state, you have persecution. So that at this time, from 359 on, anybody that was not an Arian was persecuted. The Arians went into the churches that were controlled by the Athanasians and tried to take over the churches. The Athanasians says, you're not coming in. They had bloody wars right there in the churches. People were murdered in the churches because they would not let the Arians in. It was a terrible, terrible time. But we see that when you have church and state united, you lose your liberties, especially religious liberty, and you have persecution. Constantius died in 361. So less than 2 years, actually, after this council in 359 was held, and Arianism took control of the church, the primary promoter died. He was succeeded by his cousin named Julian, and he was a young man, 20-something. He was a thorough pagan, and he had seen all this argument that had gone on between the Athanasians and the Arians, and he said, I'm not having any of this. So he worked to bring the official religion of the empire back to paganism. Of course, this didn't move the Arians or the Athanasians, and they realized, both sides of the church realized that they could not petition the emperor anymore because the emperor wasn't going to listen to them. They didn't settle their argument, but separation of church and state did come, and persecution ceased. Because the Arians couldn't fight against the Athanasians and kill anybody, they would have been persecuted for murder. So when you had a pagan emperor, you had peace in the church. Even if you didn't have theological agreement, there was peace. Because there was the next three emperors, Julius, Jovan, and Valentinian, so the time goes from 361 to 375, there was peace in the church because all three of these were pagan emperors and they chose not to get involved in the arguments in the church. In 380, after Valentinian died, he had two sons and they were both children. One was 13 and one was 6, so they were obviously not old enough to rule, had many counselors that were telling them what to do, and they ruled the eastern sector. Theodosius, who was a general, was put in charge of the western sector and ruled from Rome. Because the other two emperors were children, he took the upper hand. And he was a Catholic. In AD 380, he issued an edict declaring that it is our pleasure that the nations which are governed by our clemency and moderation should steadfastly adhere